Hi everyone, I hope you're ready for a conversation piece. Well, today I want to discuss the idea that COVID-19 and the Federal Reserve have a tremendous amount in common. Now, why would I suggest that? Well, essentially, what we've seen during this time of the pandemic is that nobody could have predicted how this virus was going to spread, and particularly not the derivatives market. So the derivatives market, which is the futures market that trades all across the world, and essentially has its origins as far back as 2,000 years ago in the temple in Jerusalem, when the moneylenders would lend money to farmers and traders who were dealing in the routes through to the Silk Road of China, and in crops for their own livelihoods. Those derivatives or money lenders were essentially trading on the profitability of the money that they were lending to people in the temple. That was the first bank. Essentially, that was the origins of what we now see around the world in the banking industry. But the Federal Reserve takes it one step further. The Federal Reserve is a privately owned bank which lends money to other banks, essentially all around the world. And one of their massive investments in the last 25 years has been China. So when the Federal Reserve invested in China at the expense of the American economy, they were betting on the fact that the Chinese would be able to outstrip the American economy, they said, by the year 2020. But what we've seen since President Trump came into office, and also we must not forget Brexit, is that suddenly those in the money markets were unable to predict which way to bet. So this form of gambling in the derivatives market, which at one point in time was valued at 7 times the annual gross domestic product of the entire world economy. Now, all of these investors got their investments incorrect. The virus came along, and predictably, we can see that economies had to shut down. Entire economies like the US economy and the UK economy have literally had to just put everything on hold. So somebody's making some money somewhere. And I suggest that the money that was lent to China in order to be able to develop its industry and its economy was done at the expense of the US taxpayer. Why do I suggest that? Well, essentially what happens when the Federal Reserve is lending money to other countries, and those countries are not having to pay tariffs on the exports of their goods back to America, that's hurting the American taxpayer. So Trump came along and he started imposing tariffs on these countries like China. And massive amounts of money were then having to be paid to the US Treasury. So China has massive investments in US Treasury Bonds at interest rates that are now inflated. If the US Treasury was to default on those loans, essentially, if China were to call on those, America would be bankrupt. But not if America and the Trump administration could prove that there was malfeasance in the Wuhan Institute of Virology developing a virus which was then released into the population. If the American government now, under President Trump, can prove that the Chinese did this deliberately, or somebody just didn't know what they were doing within the Wuhan Institute of Virology, then they can essentially default on those US Treasury bonds. That would be one way of suing the Chinese Communist Party. Essentially, all those massive loans that have been made to the US in order to be able to keep the US ticking from the Chinese economy, from the Chinese government, and ostensibly the Federal Reserve, would now be off the table. The US would then be able to claw back all that money in the same way as the Allies did after the First World War and the Second World War, when compensation had to be paid by Germany and Japan for the massive amount of money that was spent by the Allies in order to be able to defeat them. The Third World War has essentially broken out. And how this will all pan out at the end of the day will be dependent on whether President Trump can prove that the Chinese virus was man-made. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I look forward to giving you more input